Tonight we have three speakers, and I'd like to introduce the first speaker. Her name is Palmer Coppola. Did I say the last name right? Okay, good. So I'm going to read a little bit from our newsletter. If you want to read a lot more, you can go there, but just for a little bit. So Palmer Coppola is on a mission to make chronic disease history. In 2010, she reversed her own 26-year course of multiple sclerosis. To figure out how this was possible and eventually share that priceless information with others dealing with MS, Palmer quit her day job as an executive in the information technology industry to study autoimmune disorders and natural healing. Her research first took her through the emerging science of epigenetics, which shows how environmental factors control gene expression like a light switch, harm or heal. She then did coursework in functional medicine, which addresses underlying root causes of chronic disorders, and became certified in science-based stress reduction and subconscious belief-shifting techniques. Now she is pursuing certification as a functional medicine health coach through the Functional Medicine Coaching Academy, a collaboration with the Institute for Functional Medicine. And the rest I leave up to you to cover, so please welcome Palmer Coppola.
So I invite you to take a journey with me back in time to 1984. I think most of you in here can probably join me on that journey, but for those of you who are too young, just use your imagination. Prince's When Doves Cry is the #1 song on the radio that year. The Summer Olympics are taking place in Los Angeles, and that's where I am, home from college after my freshman year, where I'm a 19-year-old girl, and I'm in good health, I'm happy, I'm living at home, and I'm working as a hostess in a seafood restaurant as a summer job. One July morning, I wake up, and the soles of my feet are tingly, like that feeling that you have when you've slept on your limb is, you've slept on it, and you've cut off the blood supply and then it flows back all tingly. Only this morning, the blood did not flow back to my feet. And I noticed that as the morning went on, the tingling crept up to my ankles. And I was at my job, and the tingling kept climbing higher. And it got to my calves, and I knew something was wrong. So I called my parents, and they called the doctor, who said, take her to the neurologist at UCLA. And by the time we sat in the neurologist's office that afternoon, the tingling had crept up to my stomach, and it was just the creepiest feeling. I mean, when you are just, your full body tingling. By this time, it had reached my chest. And the neurologist is having me walk across her room, and she does a few cursory exams, like tapping my knee for my reflexes and so forth, and with a spectacular lack of sensitivity, pronounces, I am 99% certain that you have multiple sclerosis. Multiple what? We had never heard of anything multiple sclerosis, MS. She says, and if I'm right, there's nothing you can do. We can do a test for this. It's called an NMR, which is a nuclear magnetic resonance image, which is the scary precursor name for the MRI. But that's it. So my parents and I left her office, me tingling from the neck down, with little information and very little hope about what this was. And by nightfall, I'm lying in bed with my mom, who's holding me, and she's crying. And I'm crying harder because by this time, I can't feel her holding me. My chest and every part of my torso has gone completely numb. And by the time I go to sleep that night, the numbness has completely enshrouded my body, and I stayed completely numb for a full month and a half. It was a terrifying time. So we planned for my future in a wheelchair. We had absolutely no idea what to expect. We were given very little hope. There was no internet. There were no guidebooks, no playbooks. We didn't know what to expect from this. And I'm really grateful that the Summer Olympics were on TV, because that gave me a happy distraction. Every day I would want to go watch the Olympics in the living room. The problem was my bedroom was on the other side of the house. And I don't know if you've ever experienced total body numbness, but when you can't feel where your limbs are in space, it's a really strange kind of walk. So I would shuffle my way into the living room. My dad would hold me on one side and I'd grab at furniture for stability, and I'd make my way to the couch and install myself there for the afternoon. I am so thankful to my parents, who were absolute rocks, and for the friends who weren't scared off by this mysterious disease who came to visit me, and some brought me gifts. One in particular brought me a book by Norman Cousins called Anatomy of an Illness, in which Cousins recounts his own recovery from a mysterious autoimmune condition with high doses of vitamin C and laughter. Well, the laughter part made perfect sense to me, so my mom and dad and I made it our mission to watch funny things on TV. So every night we would watch I Love Lucy and Cheers and MASH and funny movies, and that's what we did. And it helped somewhat to distract myself from this terrifying illness. Another friend brought me a gift, and this was an unusual gift because it was in the form of a question. And she asked me, "Why do you think you got this MS?" Wow. I don't know. Well, it would be the most profound question and my guiding light and North Star for the next 30 years. Little did she know that, little did I know that. I'm very fortunate that by the end of the summer, the numbness began to retreat, just in time for me to go back to school. But it would take another full 2 years for the numbness to fully retreat, but I was well enough to go back to school. So off I went, back to college, and off on my 26-year course of relapsing, remitting MS. So this talk is divided into 2 parts. The first part is what I did to heal from the MS, and the second part is what I've learned in order to help others. So let's dig in. I spent 30 years trying to answer the question, how do I think I got the MS? I saw more than 30 practitioners, and all in a concerted effort to understand why I got the MS. And then when I healed, I dove into the research, I dove into studying and the books, again, all in a concerted effort to understand why we develop autoimmune conditions and what we can do about it. So let's go back to 1984 and my time on the couch. And when my friend asked me that question, "Why do you think you got the MS?" I puzzled and pondered and chewed on that for a while. And then it came to me in a flash. I actually had this vision of myself. But I have to take you back farther in time so that you can understand this. I was adopted as a baby by loving parents, but my dad had been a fighter pilot whose way was invariably the right way. And we butted heads quite a bit. And he had very strong views on the way things should be, very opinionated, and he yelled a lot. And my mom was a farm girl from South Dakota who always struggled with her weight. And my dad didn't like that very much. So he would often yell at her about that. And one of my earliest memories is me, age 3 or so. My dad is yelling at my mom. More specifically, he's yelling at the closed door. She's behind the closed bedroom door crying. And my dad is yelling at her about her weight. And I'm standing up to my dad in the hallway saying, "If you don't shut up, I'm going to make you." Little child warrior. So here I am, hyper-defensive child, hyper-vigilant, and I viewed my immune system as a proxy for my hypervigilance and hyper-defensiveness. That if there wasn't a battle that my immune system was fighting, I was going to make one up. And that's the autoimmune response. So that first hypothesis I had back in 1984 was that chronic stress was at the root of my autoimmune disease. And that still rings true for me today, even though I know there's more to the story. So over the course of 26 years, I saw 6 neurologists, each of whom told me there's nothing you can do, except, of course, take the medication. But I knew that there was more that I could do on my own. I just needed to figure out what it was. So I ran a series of what I call informal experiments over time, probably more than a dozen, but I only have time to go into the top 4 tonight. So the first experiment made perfect sense, stress reduction. If I intuited that the biggest stress, the biggest root cause of my MS was chronic stress, well then I was going to do what I could to reduce it. And I noticed that I would have significant flare-ups and exacerbations when I experienced stress. So back at school, when I had exams, I got stressed. About a week later, I would develop this incredible tightness around my torso, like I had 100 rubber bands around my stomach. Sometimes I would experience numbness in either my arms or my legs. It was really, things just showed up without any kind of plan. Other times, the stress was really severe. In particular, a time when I was working for AT&T Network Systems back in New Jersey, stressful job. I go off on a very relaxing vacation to the Caribbean. I come back into the office, and the moment I walk into the building and get under the fluorescent lights, I was struck blind in my left eye, literally, and experienced this profound pain, never experienced, like, migraine times 3. For 2 weeks, it didn't go away, and it would take 3 visits to an emergency room plus a trip down to Johns Hopkins in order to be diagnosed with optic neuritis, which is in fact a hallmark symptom of MS. So I noticed that stress created exacerbations in my life, so I started doing relaxation techniques like yoga. I started practicing in 1987. I started meditating in the early 90s. I have done many different stress reduction techniques, and I noticed that when I was calmer, I had fewer exacerbations. And conversely, when I was stressed out, whether it was conflict at home, whether it was increased job responsibilities or exams at school, I would have flare-ups, and yet symptoms still remained. Second experiment I tried, low-fat vegetarian diets. I read in Phyllis Balch's Prescription for Nutritional Healing and the MS Swank diet book that low-fat vegetarian diets were the way to go when you have MS. So I gave it a try. Macrobiotic, vegetarian, vegan, I even went raw for a while, tried them all. And what I didn't mention earlier is that for as long as I can remember, I've had tummy trouble after eating meals, and I thought that was normal, so I didn't think anything about that. I noticed that when I added whole grains to my diet, that I experienced more tummy trouble. So not only did I notice no MS symptom reduction, I started experiencing this symptom called Lhermitte sign. When you bend your neck forward, you get zapped with this electrical feeling that goes all the way down your back. That was very concerning, also a hallmark symptom of MS. And that persisted even when I tried these diets. So, on to the next experiment. Medication. For years, I saw neurologists, and each of them persisted that I needed to go on a medication, that in fact would be my best insurance policy to protect me from a future in a wheelchair with MS. And I resisted as long as I possibly could. I am adverse to taking medication. I don't like needles. But finally, an especially persistent neuro at Stanford said I needed to pick one of the ABC drugs. So I chose a non-interferon, one purported to have the fewest side effects, and went for it for 4 years. I injected myself with this medication every single night. I didn't notice any symptom reduction with this medication, in part because at this point I was doing a lot of stress reduction techniques. I was doing my deep breathing, I'm practicing yoga, I'm meditating daily. So I'm able to manage my symptoms often with stress reduction. Medication didn't notice any symptom reduction. In fact, I noticed some additional symptoms that I call 3 strikes. The first strike is lipoatrophy. So everywhere you inject yourself in the fatty tissues of your body, where you inject yourself, the fat doesn't grow back. So you get these divots in your fatty places, not very sightly. Second strike was far worse than this. 15 minutes after I inject myself one evening, I start developing shortness of breath, a tightening in my chest. I go cold and clammy and start having chest pain, and I believe I'm having a heart attack. One of the most terrifying times. And thankfully, I had been forewarned by the medication nurse that heart attack symptoms are in fact a common side effect of this particular medication. I'm not sure how much comfort I took in that. but that was the second strike. The third strike was injecting myself as normal on my hip, only this time it doesn't heal. It becomes infected and a wound is created, and it would take 6 months and 6 visits to a wound care clinic to help me heal this wound on my hip, which I still have a scar from. So I quit the medication. The fourth experiment and final experiment is what I call gut healing. Now, I had mentioned that I had some tummy trouble after eating meals that I thought everybody experienced, so I didn't think this was a big deal. But by 2010, I was learning enough about nutrition to know that maybe it was time that I go see a nutritionist to get to the bottom of this tummy trouble. And she was a functional medicine nutritionist, and she ran a series of tests. And sure enough, I come to find out that I've got non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So she educates me about the perils of gluten and what it's doing to inflame my gut. And she educates me about an elimination diet and tells me what to take out of my diet for 30 days. And in the meantime, we're going to heal my gut with some very healing herbs and so forth. And we would do that for 30 days. Well, I went cold turkey on gluten the day that I found out that I was sensitive to it. And without exaggeration, within a few days, I stopped having tummy trouble after every meal. And more important than that, within a week of stopping the gluten, I stopped having any and all MS symptoms ever again. Period. End of story. Stopped having MS symptoms ever again. And what was notable about this is that at the time I had these tests done, when I would wake up in the morning, I would feel this heaviness in my legs, like really difficult walking. I felt like I was underwater. I had all kinds of other sensory issues like tingling feet and issues with my arms. So the before and after this test and removing the gluten was really, really striking. So I call this my Eureka experiment. So let's look at before and after. Between 1984 and 2010, I had the signs and symptoms consistent with MS. Neurologists look at MRIs, they look at symptoms, they look at exacerbations over time, and now we have antibody tests, blood tests that can show whether or not your neurological tissues, your antibodies to those tissues are in the normal range or not. Well, I found out that I was sensitive to gluten. Later, I did some Cyrex testing, found out that I was sensitive to cow dairy, which I removed those things. And 2 years ago, I found my birth father by accident and discovered that he too was diagnosed with MS 25 years ago. So signs and symptoms correlated with MS. Flashing forward to 2010 to today, signs and symptoms consistent with vibrant health. I've not experienced a single symptom since removing gluten from my diet. I've minimized stress. I healed and sealed the leaky gut. My neurologist, what do you think the neurologist said to me when I told him this story?
Wasn't MS. Wasn't MS.
Yeah, something like that. Well, it seems that your MS was benign after all.
Do you have any lesions?
That's a good question, which we'll get to. So yes, I have had several MRIs that did show lesions. So the question is, did I have MS? Or was it Lyme disease? Or was it gluten ataxia? Does it even matter, right? Sorry?
It does.
It does. Okay. Well, we'll address that. I think we're going to do some Q&A at the very end of this, so that will be a good thing. No, it's good. So here is the Cyrex report that shows that my antibodies are all in the normal range to my neurological tissues. Good news. So summarizing the 4 experiments, stress reduction helped somewhat. The low-fat vegetarian diet made things worse. Medication caused additional strikes, additional symptoms. Other experiments I did was getting my vitamin D levels from 30 to 80. I got rid of my mercury fillings. I minimized my exposure to toxins, all those things. Didn't have really remarkable results with those, couldn't tell. But the one holy grail for me was removing the gluten. So back to the big question, why do I think I got the MS? Well, have you heard of the total body burden? It's the cumulative load of toxins that we have in our bodies. And while genes play a very small role, it's the inflammatory toxins that build up until we develop something called a leaky gut, and things start to spill over, and that's the autoimmune cascade. So how did I heal? By emptying the toxin bucket. So you identify what your inflammatory items are. My inflammatory environmental factors, remove those. Healed and sealed my leaky gut, likely a leaky brain as well. And I modified the genetic expression. See, I'll always have the genes for the MS, but it doesn't mean I have to have the expression of the MS. So once I healed myself, I quit my job to study why people develop autoimmune conditions and how we can possibly reverse them. The first thing I did was delve into the research, and I found some really paradigm-shifting research that started more than 10 years ago. And the first thing I found was that our DNA is absolutely not our destiny, but this new field of epigenetics, which literally means above the gene, is what is running the show. So it's the environment that matters most. What you eat, drink, think, and do give direction to your genes on how to behave, and that's where the harm or heal, inflame or restore comes in. Every forkful of food you take gives instructions to your genes on how to behave. It's the environment that matters most. The second research that I came across was Alessio Fasano's research, and he spoke here several months ago. He discovered the third part of the equation that is the autoimmune triad equation, which shows that our genes are part of the equation, having a predisposition to something. Inflammatory environmental factors that fill that toxic bucket until it goes tilt, and a leaky gut or hyperintestinal permeability, if you prefer. And what is so exciting about this research is that the implication is that you can flip the equation and reverse the condition. So by detecting and removing your environmental factors, healing and sealing your gut, you modify the genetic expression so that you can reverse or prevent these disorders. So now I was eureka, I can help people with this. But now I need to figure out what are those inflammatory factors that people can control. So I delved back into the research, and I came up with a list of things, and I put together a sheet of paper that I called my root cause reversal checklist, and I started cold calling practitioners. And I met with about a dozen allopathic and functional medicine practitioners, and I cold called Aristo Vojdani and asked for a meeting saying, I really want to help people reverse and prevent these conditions. Can you help me understand the truth of autoimmune conditions? Here's my sheet that I put together from the research. What am I missing? Is there anything that I'm missing here? Poke holes in this. I really want to understand. And they were kind enough to give me their time. And so I got validation that the 6 categories that I came up with were the categories that needed to be addressed. And what is striking about these 6 categories is that when I wrote them down on paper, they actually spelled a word, and that word is fights. For food, infections, gut health, hormone balance, toxins, and stress. So I don't have time to go into the science of all of these, but I really will hit the high points on each of them, give maybe a snapshot of a story and what you can do to try for yourself. Start with food. Back in 2002, the New England Journal of Medicine published a study that 55 diseases are caused, in fact, by eating gluten. Say that again. Thank you. Thank you. I'm writing a book now of autoimmune practitioners, and each one of them agrees you've got to remove your inflammatory foods. Do that first. And if you have any concern that you have autoimmune in your family or you have an autoimmune condition, you must remove gluten. So what can you do? Do an experiment. Take it out of your diet for 30 days. Introduce a tiny bit and observe your side effects, any reactions you might have. It might be gastrointestinal, but then again, it might not be. It might be brain fog, you might have a headache or something else. Second on the list are infections. Many scientists believe that chronic infections are indeed at the root of many of these autoimmune conditions. A quick example is Anne Baroque is a naturopathic practitioner. She had MS, and she believes that it was a systemic yeast infection at the root of her MS. And in fact, it was a sugar addiction at the root of her yeast infection. So she didn't heal the MS until she healed the Candida, and she didn't heal Candida until she removed sugar. She was able to do all of the above and no longer has MS. So what can you do for yourself? Many practitioners believe in strengthening the host as opposed to a direct approach of trying to kill the virus. Make yourself inhospitable to the bacteria, the viruses, the parasites. Get the toxins out of your life. Add in the nourishing lifestyle practices. Gut health. Touched on this with Vojdani's study, which says in all cases, increased intestinal permeability precedes the advent of autoimmune conditions. Every practitioner that I'm interviewing, a dozen out of a dozen, every single one has gut healing as part of their healing protocol for any kind of autoimmune condition. So what can you do? There's something called the 5R Gut Healing Program. You can Google it online. Get rid of the pathogens and any inflammatory foods out of your environment. Replace with nourishing foods, and if you're over 40, chances are you need enzymes. Reinoculate your microbiome with good bacteria, the probiotics, and feed them with prebiotics. Repair the lining of your gut, any breached barriers, and rebalance your life with more rest and relaxation, and that's a pretty solid gut healing program. Hormone balance. Autoimmune conditions disproportionately affect women. 80% of all autoimmune conditions are female, and especially women of childbearing years. So between menarche, menopause, those are prime time for women to become susceptible to autoimmune conditions. What can you do? Upgrade your lifestyle. Get the carbs that you don't need out of your diet, optimize your D levels, start to exercise, reduce your stress. These are all very much a subtle approach to balancing hormones and maybe a good first place to start. And if this isn't sufficient for you, work with a practitioner to do something as natural as possible with hormones. Toxins. This just floored me. This is the reason why autoimmune conditions are on the rise today. And within the category of toxins, it turns out that it's the medications, the prescription drugs that are at the root of autoimmune conditions. So, an example of this, Jill Carnahan, functional medicine MD in Colorado, was diagnosed with breast cancer when she was 25, went on the standard of care chemotherapy and radiation, which she believed is what triggered her Crohn's disease, which is autoimmune. So it wasn't until she healed from the toxins and healed her gut that she was able to heal. What can you do? If you can minimize or eliminate unnecessary medications, do that. Get the chemicals out of your environment, replace them. Everything matters when it comes to your total body burden. And finally, biggest one for last, stress. We know that chronic psychological stress, repeated acute stress, even childhood emotional trauma is at the root of autoimmune conditions. In fact, having an autoimmune condition is stressful, so it becomes a vicious cycle. Anything that you can do to reduce stress in your life is very beneficial. One quick story, Susan Blum, medical doctor, had just finished medical school. She was working in a hospital, and she would go from room to room just handing out medications to people. And then she got this profound existential crisis that she was in the wrong career because she thought she went into medicine to help people heal, but she found she's giving them drugs that may be harming them more than helping them. So this was a mismatch. She figured that this was not the right place for her. On top of this, she had 3 young sons, one of whom was hyperactive, and she feels that this was at the root of her developing Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And it wasn't until she addressed her life, mind, body, spirit, with stress reduction approaches that she in fact healed from the Hashimoto's. So simple experiment for you to do if stress is a big deal in your life. I have found for me that by taking an inventory of things that are stressing me out, literally writing them down and deciding what you can do with them to eliminate, minimize, delegate, give to someone else or give to God if you can't control it, but get it off of your plate as you can, the better. And add in some nourishing things that you love to do every day. To summarize, Aristo Vojdani's beautifully elegant quote, detect, remove, repair, identify your environmental root causes by using the FIGHTS categories, get them out of your environment, repair the lining of your gut and any damaged tissues with targeted nutrition. And finally, a quote I love, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed that is not faced. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're going to do a little switch here, and